The scent of beeswax and old stone was the first thing Ilara had ever known of God. In the small country chapel of her youth, it was the perfume of prayer, clean and pure. Here, in the heart of the kingdom, at the royal palace of Viridia, it was the scent of power. It clung to the thousand candles that bled golden light onto marble floors, turning them into molten rivers. It rose from the polished wood of the great hall's vaulted ceiling, a silent testament to the centuries of kings who had sheltered beneath it. Ilara felt impossibly small, a brown wren in an aviary of peacocks. Her woolen traveling dress, so fine and well-made in her father's modest barony, felt like sackcloth against the whisper of silk and the rustle of brocade that surrounded her. Ladies of the court drifted past, their faces serene, otherworldly masks of pearl-white perfection. Their gowns, studded with jewels that shimmered like captured stars, left wakes of heavy, cloying perfume. Rose, and something darker, something musky and resinous like ambergris. This, she thought, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, was the fairy tale made real. The stories her nursemaid had told her of queens and courtiers living in splendor had not been lies after all. It was all true. She drew a deep breath, wanting to fill her lungs with the very essence of majesty. And then it hit her. Beneath the roses, beneath the ambergris, beneath the beeswax and the polish, there was another smell. It was a rank, deeply human odor, a feral tang that the cloying perfumes sought not to complement, but to bludgeon into submission. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, of sickness and decay, all trapped beneath layers of silk and velvet. Her eyes watered. The magnificent tapestry on the far wall, depicting a great hunt with threads of pure gold, seemed to ripple, the figures blurring, the fairy tale soured in her throat. A woman approached, her smile a painted slash of crimson on a canvas of white. She was the Duchess of Albret, Ilara's new mistress, the first lady of the queen's bedchamber. Her gown was a cascade of sapphire silk, her sleeves dripping with pearls the size of robin's eggs. She was the most beautiful woman Ilara had ever seen, and the smell emanating from her was a physical assault. "You must be Lady Ilara," the Duchess said, her voice a melodious chime that seemed entirely disconnected from the miasma surrounding her. "Welcome to court. The Queen will see you presently. Do try not to look so terrified, child. It's unbecoming." Ilara curtsied, her knees trembling, trying desperately not to breathe through her nose. This was not a storybook. This was a gilded cage, and she was beginning to understand that it was filled not with songbirds, but with beautifully rotting things. The Queen's chambers. The Queen's private chambers were a sanctuary of horror. Ilara's first duty as a junior lady-in-waiting was to assist with Her Majesty's morning ritual. The Queen, Annalise, was a woman forged in the crucible of politics and paranoia. She had the eyes of a hawk and a mind that could dissect a treaty or a courtier's loyalties with equal chilling precision. But as she sat before her vanity, the dawn light filtering cruelly through the leaded glass, she was something entirely else. Her face, in the moments before the day's artifice began, was a terrifying ruin. It was a patchwork of graying, puckered skin marred by faint scars and angry red blotches. Yesterday's paint, Venetian ceruse, the Duchess whispered its name with reverence, was a cracked and flaking landscape. "The pot," the Duchess commanded, and another lady, her face a familiar mask of bored indifference, presented a small porcelain jar. Inside was a thick white paste. I caught its scent, the sharp, acrid bite of vinegar, and a faint, yet deeply unsettling metallic sweetness. Ilara watched, her stomach churning, as the Duchess took a soft brush and began to paint the fresh poison directly over the old. There was no washing, no cleansing. Water, Ilara was learning, was considered dangerous, a shock to the system that invited illness. Instead, they simply entombed the decay. They layered fresh illusion over yesterday's ruin, creating an ever-thickening mask of toxicity. Her Majesty's complexion is the mirror of the kingdom's purity, the Duchess explained, her voice low. It must be flawless, ethereal, a reflection of her divine right. The queen sat impossibly still, her eyes closed, as the thick, lead-based paint was smoothed across her skin, filling the wrinkles, hiding the sores, creating the ghostly white visage of power. But I could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breath hitched as the metallic fumes rose from her own face. This wasn't a beauty routine. It was a slow, ritualistic suicide performed daily in the name of an impossible standard. The psychological toll was written in the queen's volatile temper. One moment, she was sharp and lucid, her commands echoing with absolute authority. The next, she would descend into a fog of confusion, forgetting conversations mid-sentence, her eyes darting about with a hunted paranoia. The courtiers blamed the pressures of the crown. But Ilara, smelling the lead on her breath, seeing the damage it wrought, was beginning to understand the truth. The queen wasn't just ruling an empire, she was being systematically poisoned by it. The crawling court. The first time she felt it, Ilara almost cried out. A tiny tickling sensation on her scalp, a phantom movement in her hair. She tried to dismiss it, but it came again more insistent this time. She glanced at the other ladies. They stood in perfect regal stillness, but she saw it now. The almost imperceptible twitch of a shoulder, the subtle clenching of a jaw, the way a jeweled finger would drift towards a powdered wig, as if by accident. Lice. They were everywhere. Lady Anne, a woman whose family had served at court for generations, noticed Ilara's distress. She gave a small, conspiratorial smile and discreetly produced a long, thin stick of carved ivory, its end shaped like a delicate claw. With practiced elegance, she slid it beneath her towering headdress and scratched, a look of sublime relief momentarily gracing her features. One becomes accustomed, she murmured, tucking the scratching stick back into a hidden pocket in her sleeve. A small price for fashion, my dear. But the true horror was revealed a few days later when Ilara was tasked with helping Lady Anne prepare for a state banquet. The construction of her hairstyle was an architectural feat, a process that took 4 hours and 3 servants. It began not with washing, but with grease. A servant arrived with a wooden bowl filled with a thick, yellowish substance, rendered bear fat. The rancid, gamey smell filled the room. This fat was slathered through Lady Anne's hair, serving as an adhesive for pads of horsehair, and finally the powdered wig itself. As the stylist worked, combing the foul-smelling grease through the matted locks, she saw them, tiny dark specks, moving. The fat was not just a styling product. It was a warm, moist, and endless nourishing environment for entire colonies of parasites. The stylist worked around them with a grim professionalism, her own nose wrinkled in disgust. The final touch was a dusting of pale blue powder, which settled over the grease and the insects, sealing them into a pastel tomb. Lady Anne's head was now a magnificent, towering sculpture of filth and crawling life. She would wear it for at least a fortnight. Exquisite, Lady Anne said, admiring herself in a silver mirror, seemingly oblivious to the writhing ecosystem she now carried. I felt a wave of nausea. These women who held court with such grace, who decided the fates of men with a flick of a fan, were living monuments to human suffering. They were marinating in their own filth, their scalps crawling with vermin, their skin burning with poison. They fought constant, maddening urges to scratch, to scrub, to be clean, all while presenting a facade of divine, untouchable elegance. It was a grotesque theater, and everyone was playing their part to perfection. Whispers and stenches.
Power at court, Ilara soon learned,
was a currency traded in whispers and proximity, and no one was more proximate to power than Sir Giles, the groom of the king's close stool. He was a man of startling influence, his sober black doublet a stark contrast to the court's finery. His counsel was sought by dukes, his favor curried by ambassadors. His job was to carry the king's portable toilet, a velvet-cushioned box, and to clean the monarch afterwards. Ilara first saw him emerging from the king's private study, his face a mask of discretion. The king, a man who famously boasted he had not submerged his body in water since his christening, was a walking miasma. The air that followed Sir Giles out of the room was thick with a foulness that made Ilara's stomach heave, yet he walked with the dignity of a chancellor. One afternoon she found herself walking beside him in one of the palace's less frequented gardens. He regarded her with shrewd, intelligent eyes. "You find our ways perplexing, Lady Ilara," he stated, not as a question. "I find them difficult to comprehend, Sir Giles." He gave a dry chuckle. "Dignity is a performance. True power lies in what is hidden. The king is never more honest than when he is at his most vulnerable. He signs treaties, declares wars, and orders executions, while I am kneeling behind him. He tells me his fears, his pains, his doubts. What is the stench of his body compared to the weight of his secrets?" It was a terrifying logic. To gain influence, one had to endure the unendurable, to breathe the unbreathable, to witness the most degrading aspects of human existence and call it honor. The path to power was paved not with gold, but with filth. This lesson was reinforced by the presence of Don Alvaro, the Spanish envoy. He was a severe, unsmiling man who moved through the Viridian court like a specter. He held his perfumed handkerchief to his nose constantly, not as a fashionable affectation, but as a shield. His posture was rigid with a disdain that went beyond mere politics. One evening, at a small, private gathering, Ilara found herself cornered with him. He had been watching her, she realized, noting her barely concealed revulsion at the court's realities. "You still believe in cleanliness, my lady," he said, his voice a low, bitter rasp. "A dangerous belief in some parts of Christendom." "Is it not next to godliness?" she replied, parroting a phrase her mother had loved. His eyes flashed with a cold fire. "In my country, it is next to heresy. When the Catholic monarchs conquered Granada, they did more than drive out the Moors. They declared war on their very way of life. My grandmother, she loved the bathhouses. She believed, as the Muslims did, that water was a gift from God, a way to purify the body and the soul." He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped his handkerchief. The Inquisition saw it differently. They saw hedonism. They saw a rejection of Christ's suffering. To be clean was to be suspect. They destroyed the bathhouses. They questioned families who used too much water. My grandmother was taken for questioning because her linens were too white. She was burned as a heretic. Ilara stared at him, horrified. She had thought the filth of Viridia was a matter of ignorance and vanity. She had never imagined that it could be weaponized, that the deliberate embrace of squalor could be a tenet of faith, that soap could be considered a tool of the devil. Don Alvaro's personal tragedy cast a far darker shadow over the court's grime. It wasn't just a lack of hygiene, it was an ideology of filth. The monthly ritual. The day of the Queen's monthly bath was spoken of in hushed, dreaded tones. It was an event of state, a monumental undertaking that required the labor of 20 servants. Ilara, to her horror, was chosen to attend. The fires in the kitchen had been roaring since midnight, heating cauldron after cauldron of water. The great wooden tub, large enough to hold a small boat, was brought into the queen's antechamber. It was lined with fine linen to protect the royal flesh from splinters. The air grew thick with steam, which did little to mask the underlying smells of the room. When the queen was finally disrobed, the full horror of her daily ritual was laid bare. Her body, rarely exposed to air or water, was pale and doughy, but her face, neck, and hands were a geological map of her vanity. Layers upon layers of the Venetian ceruse had built up into a thick, cracked crust. As she stepped into the tub, the water immediately turned a milky grayish white. It was the color of death. Chunks of the lead paint began to peel away from her skin like shedding bark, floating on the surface in obscene white sheets. Gray flakes of dead skin clouded the water, mixing with brown stains of accumulated sweat and grime. And the smell rising from that tub defied description. It was the metallic tang of lead, the sourness of vinegar, and the ammonia-sharp stench of months-old human secretions, all warmed with the water to an olfactory assault that made Alara's vision swim. She stood, holding a drying towel, her stomach a tight knot of revulsion, her lungs burning. Queen Annalise sat amidst the dissolving filth, her face a mask of regal endurance. For her, this was not a moment of cleansing, but a trial to be borne. It was considered dangerously excessive by her physicians, a shock that could leave the body vulnerable to any number of malevolent humors. Alara watched, mesmerized and disgusted, as the queen's true face slowly emerged from beneath the toxic layers. It was the face of an old, tired woman, a prisoner in a cage of her own making. In that moment, stripped of her paint and her power, marinating in her own waste, Alara felt a flicker of something she did not expect: pity. It was a fleeting, terrible thing to feel pity for a queen who held the power of life and death, yet could not escape the prison of her own skin. A charitable death. The plot twist in her understanding of the court's cruelty did not come from the queen, but from a visiting German noblewoman, the Countess von Platen. The Countess was a woman of legendary beauty, though now her face was hidden behind an even thicker mask of ceruse than the queen's. She suffered from what the court physicians delicately called a distressing malady, a euphemism for the pox that was ravaging the European aristocracy. Her skin, they whispered, was a landscape of open sores, her body consumed by an infection that had reportedly eaten away part of her nose. To soothe her constant burning agony, she took a daily bath in warm milk. It was a scene of grotesque luxury. One afternoon, Alara was passing through a service corridor when she saw a line of peasants gathered near the kitchens. A servant from the Countess's retinue was ladling milk from a large wooden bucket into their waiting pails. It was the milk from the Countess's bath. "Her ladyship is most generous," the servant announced with a flourish. "She donates her leftover milk to the poor so that they too may share in her abundance." The peasants murmured their thanks, their faces etched with gratitude. They saw a gift from heaven, fresh milk for their starving children. Alara saw a death sentence disguised as charity. She saw the Countess's diseased body, her weeping sores, her infected fluids, all swirling in the very liquid now being doled out to the unsuspecting poor. She wanted to scream, to warn them, but a sharp look from one of the queen's guards froze her words in the throat. To question a noble's charity was to question their honor, a far greater crime than poisoning a few peasants. The deeply psychological disconnect was staggering. The poor were not quite human. Their lives were expendable, their deaths a minor inconvenience compared to the comfort of a noblewoman. The casual, almost thoughtless cruelty of it was more horrifying than any deliberate act of malice. This wasn't just filth. It was a system of biological warfare waged by the privileged against the powerless. the gilded cesspit. The arrival of the French ambassador, the Marquis de Sèvres, brought with it tales of a palace that made Viridio seem a model of sanitation, Versailles. He spoke of its golden halls, its acres of mirrors, its gardens so vast they touched the horizon. He described it as the Sun King's earthly paradise, the center of the civilized world. But in private, over glasses of smuggled brandy, with a handful of trusted courtiers, the Marquis painted a different picture. 10,000 souls, he breathed, his eyes wide with a kind of post-traumatic shock. 10,000 nobles, servants, officials, all crammed into a space with perhaps a dozen functional latrines. You speak of stench? You know nothing of stench. He described corridors slick with urine, where ladies in their magnificent gowns would simply stop, pull up their skirts, and relieve themselves where they stood. He spoke of men urinating off the balustrade in the royal chapel during Mass. He told a story of the Dauphine herself being struck by human waste thrown from an overhead window as she walked through an interior courtyard. The air, mon Dieu, the air is a soup. It is a physical presence in the room, a mixture of waste, sweat, perfume, and rotting food. You don't breathe it, you chew it. We learn to walk with our eyes on the floor, to navigate the puddles. We develop techniques for breathing through our mouths, for holding conversations at a precise distance. It is the pinnacle of civilization, you see. We have become so refined that we have learned to live gracefully in a cesspit. His words hung in the air, a vision of their own court's future, magnified to a terrifying degree. The Viridian court was a microcosm of the same horror. It was a world built on a complete disconnect between appearance and reality, a gilded cage built of its own waste. The climax of filth. The grand ball celebrating the king's 30th years on the throne was the culmination of everything Alara had come to fear. The great hall was ablaze with thousands of candles, the heat oppressive. It warmed the room, and with it, the stench. The competing perfumes of hundreds of courtiers mixed with the smell of their unwashed bodies, the rancid grease in their hair, and the faint